The formation of Hamas in 1987 played a profound and enduring role in shaping, intensifying, and prolonging the cycles of violence that later culminated in repeated wars between Israel and Gaza. To understand how Hamas contributed to the escalation of the Israel-Gaza conflict, it is necessary to situate its emergence within the broader historical, social, political, and ideological context of Palestinian life under occupation, the failures of earlier political strategies, and the evolving security doctrine of Israel. Hamas did not arise in a vacuum. It emerged from decades of displacement, military rule, and frustration, and once established, it fundamentally altered the nature of the conflict by transforming it from a largely nationalist struggle into one deeply infused with religious ideology, armed resistance, and uncompromising political goals. Before Hamas existed, Gaza was already a site of intense suffering and instability. Following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Gaza came under Egyptian control and absorbed a massive refugee population expelled or displaced from what became Israel. These refugees lived in overcrowded camps, dependent on international aid, with little political autonomy or economic opportunity. When Israel captured Gaza during the 1967 war, the territory came under direct Israeli military occupation, although Israel allowed limited economic interaction, such as Gazans working inside Israel. Political freedoms were tightly restricted, land was expropriated, settlements were later established, and resistance was harshly suppressed. Over time, resentment grew, especially among younger Palestinians who saw no realistic path toward independence or dignity. During the 1970s and early 1980s, Palestinian political life was largely dominated by secular nationalist movements, particularly the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO framed the conflict primarily in national and political terms, seeking statehood and self-determination. In Gaza, however, the PLO's organizational presence was weaker than in the West Bank or abroad, partly due to Israeli repression and partly because Gaza's social fabric was more conservative and religious. Into this environment stepped Islamist networks linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, which focused on social welfare, religious education, and community organization rather than armed struggle. Ironically, Israel initially tolerated and even indirectly encouraged these Islamist groups as a counterweight to the PLO, viewing them as less threatening and less militant. The outbreak of the First Intifada in late 1987 marked a turning point. This mass uprising against Israeli occupation was driven by grassroots anger, economic hardship, and daily humiliation. It was largely spontaneous at first, involving strikes, protests, and civil disobedience. The Islamist networks in Gaza quickly recognized both a challenge and an opportunity. In December 1987, Hamas was formally established as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, declaring its intention to participate actively in the uprising and to resist Israeli occupation through all means, including armed struggle. From its inception, Hamas distinguished itself from secular Palestinian factions by framing the conflict as not only a national struggle but also a religious obligation. The ideological foundation of Hamas, articulated most clearly in its 1988 charter, played a significant role in escalating the conflict. The charter rejected any permanent peace with Israel, denied Israel's legitimacy, and defined all of historic Palestine as an Islamic endowment that could not be surrendered. This absolutist position left little room for compromise or negotiated settlement, while later Hamas leaders would sometimes adopt more pragmatic language. The movement's core ideology fostered a zero-sum view of the conflict. This stood in sharp contrast to the PLO's eventual acceptance of a two-state solution in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The emergence of Hamas thus fractured Palestinian politics and created competing visions of liberation. One pragmatic and diplomatic, the other religious and militant. As the First Intifada unfolded, Hamas rapidly expanded its influence in Gaza through a combination of social services, religious legitimacy, and resistance activities. It built mosques, clinics, schools, and charities that filled gaps left by both Israeli authorities and the PLO. These institutions helped Hamas gained popular support, especially among the poor and marginalized. At the same time, Hamas established a military wing that carried out attacks against Israeli soldiers and, later, Israeli civilians. These actions escalated the level of violence and introduced new tactics, including suicide bombings in the 1990s, which had a profound psychological impact on Israeli society and politics. The rise of Hamas had significant consequences for Israel's approach to Gaza. Israeli policymakers increasingly viewed Gaza not just as an occupied territory with a hostile population, but as a base for an ideologically committed militant organization dedicated to Israel's destruction. This perception hardened Israeli security policies and reduced political willingness to make concessions. During the Oslo peace process of the 1990s, Israel negotiated with the PLO and the newly formed Palestinian Authority. But Hamas rejected Oslo outright and sought to undermine it through violent attacks. Each attack strengthened Israeli skepticism about the peace process and empowered Israeli political forces that argued there was no Palestinian partner for peace. Hamas's opposition to Oslo also deepened internal Palestinian divisions. While the Palestinian Authority, dominated by Fatah, pursued negotiations and limited self-rule, Hamas positioned itself as the guardian of resistance and moral integrity. This rivalry often turned violent, weakening Palestinian institutions and undermining their ability to present a unified front from Israel's perspective. This fragmentation reinforced the idea that security control was necessary and that withdrawals would lead to increased attacks rather than peace. The period following Israel's unilateral disengagement from Gaza in 2005 marked another critical stage in the escalation. Israel withdrew its settlers and permanent military installations from the Strip, arguing that it was ending its occupation there. Many Palestinians, including Hamas, interpreted the withdrawal as a victory for armed resistance rather than a step toward negotiated peace. This interpretation strengthened Hamas's narrative that violence, not diplomacy, forced Israeli concessions in the 2006 Palestinian legislative elections. Hamas won a surprising victory, capitalizing on public frustration with corruption and ineffectiveness within Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. Hamas's election victory and subsequent takeover of Gaza in 2007 dramatically altered the dynamics of the conflict. Israel, along with Egypt and much of the international community, responded by imposing a severe blockade on Gaza, aiming to isolate Hamas and prevent it from acquiring weapons. Hamas, now governing Gaza, faced the dual challenge of administering a densely populated, impoverished territory while continuing its resistance against Israel. The blockade exacerbated humanitarian suffering, contributing to widespread unemployment, poverty, and infrastructure collapse. Hamas used this suffering both as a rallying cry against Israel and as justification for continued armed struggle. From this point onward, the Israel-Gaza relationship became defined by repeated cycles of escalation. Hamas and other armed groups in Gaza launched rockets into southern Israel, often indiscriminately, while Israel responded with airstrikes, ground incursions, and targeted killings. Each round of fighting reinforced mutual hostility and fear. Hamas portrayed its actions as legitimate resistance to siege and occupation, while Israel framed its military campaigns as necessary self-defense against terrorism. Civilians on both sides, particularly in Gaza, bore the brunt of the violence. The formation of Hamas thus contributed to escalation in several interconnected ways. Ideologically, it introduced a religiously framed, uncompromising vision of the conflict that reduced space for negotiated solutions. Politically, it split the Palestinian national movement, weakening moderate leadership and complicating diplomatic efforts. Militarily, it adopted tactics that deliberately targeted Israeli civilians, provoking harsh Israeli retaliation and entrenching a cycle of violence. Strategically, it transformed Gaza into a focal point of confrontation, where localized clashes could quickly escalate into large-scale wars. Over time, Hamas's governance of Gaza further entrenched this dynamic. As the de facto authority, Hamas invested heavily in military capabilities, including rocket production, tunnels, and armed training. Viewing deterrence and resistance as essential to its survival and legitimacy. Israel, in turn, invested in missile defense systems, intelligence operations, and periodic large-scale offensives designed to degrade Hamas's capabilities. Neither side achieved decisive victory, but each round of conflict deepened trauma, radicalization, and distrust. The long-term impact of Hamas's formation can also be seen in how it reshaped regional and international perceptions of the Gaza conflict. Israel successfully framed Hamas as part of a broader Islamist militant threat, linking it rhetorically to groups like Hezbollah and, at times, global jihadist movements. This framing helped Israel gain international support or tolerance for its military actions, even as humanitarian concerns grew. Hamas, meanwhile, sought backing from regional actors opposed to Israel, embedding the Gaza conflict within wider Middle Eastern power struggles. At the societal level, the presence of Hamas and the constant state of confrontation with Israel profoundly affected life in Gaza. Generations grew up under blockade and periodic war, with limited economic prospects and pervasive insecurity. Hamas's emphasis on resistance became deeply woven into social and educational narratives, reinforcing a culture of confrontation. On the Israeli side, communities near Gaza lived under the threat of rocket fire, shaping public opinion toward hardline security policies and skepticism toward peace initiatives. In this sense, the formation of Hamas in 1987 did not simply add another actor to an existing conflict, it transformed the nature of that conflict. It shifted Gaza from being one arena of a broader Israeli-Palestinian struggle into a central symbol of intractable hostility, where ideological absolutism, asymmetric warfare, and civilian suffering intersected. While many other factors contributed to the escalation of wars between Israel and Gaza, including Israeli policies, regional dynamics, and international failures, Hamas's emergence was a pivotal development that reshaped strategies, expectations, and outcomes on both sides. Ultimately, the role of Hamas in escalating the Israel-Gaza war cannot be understood solely in terms of its actions or ideology. Its rise was also a response to structural conditions, prolonged occupation, political exclusion, economic deprivation, and the collapse of faith in diplomatic solutions. Yet once established, Hamas became an independent driver of escalation, locking Gaza and Israel into a destructive cycle that has proven extraordinarily difficult to break. The legacy of its formation in 1987 continues to reverberate through every subsequent confrontation, shaping not only the wars themselves, but also the grim reality that peace remains elusive for both Palestinians and Israelis.